A question that wouldn't leave me. Have you ever noticed how the most uncomfortable questions never arrive during dramatic moments, but slip quietly into your mind when everything looks fine from the outside? This video is about one of those questions. Over the past 2 weeks in the United States, in the middle of marriage, children, unfinished conversations, and slow English practice, I kept asking myself something simple and unsettling. What imperfection can you love today? If you are tired, stuck, or quietly thinking of giving up, on English, on a relationship, or on yourself, this story is for you. It started on a calm morning. No argument. No crisis. Just the soft noise of traffic outside, my children moving around the house, and my partner doing something ordinary in the kitchen. Everything looked stable. And yet, inside me, there was resistance. A tightness. That familiar feeling that says, something isn't right, but I don't know what to fix first. 2 weeks ago, I arrived in the US carrying expectations I didn't even realize I had. Expectations about how family time should feel. About how marriage should look when life finally slows down. About how I should be calmer, better, more patient by now. My brain quietly assumed that a new place, a different routine, and good intentions would magically smooth out the rough edges. Instead, the rough edges became clearer. Here's the strange part. Nothing was actually wrong. And that was exactly what made it uncomfortable. When there is no obvious problem, your mind invents one. Psychologists call this the brain's need for cognitive closure. It hates ambiguity more than it hates pain. So it scans your life and whispers, if you feel uneasy, something must be broken. That whisper followed me everywhere. While making coffee. While watching my kids argue over something meaningless. While trying to practice English slowly, sentence by sentence, and feeling irrationally annoyed when I mispronounced a word I already knew. I caught myself thinking, I should be better at this. Better at being a parent. Better at being a partner. Better at English. Better at appreciating what I already have. That word, should, is dangerous. It sounds motivational, but it works like sandpaper on your nervous system. Each should quietly removes a layer of peace. One afternoon, while sitting alone for a moment of silence, a sentence appeared in my mind, simple and uninvited. What imperfection can you love today? Not fix. Not explain. Not tolerate. Love. At first, I rejected it. Love imperfection? That sounds like giving up. But the more I sat with it, the more it unsettled me, in a good way. Because I realized how much of my energy was spent trying to mentally edit my life into a cleaner version. A version where conversations go smoothly. Where children listen the first time. Where learning English feels linear and rewarding instead of slow and humbling. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is wired to predict and control. When it can't, it triggers low-level stress, even in safe environments. That stress doesn't scream. It hums. And after a while, you mistake that hum for who you are. That was me. Not unhappy. Just quietly resisting reality. This channel exists for slow English listening, reading, and speaking. But underneath that, it's really about something else. Learning how to stay present when progress feels imperfect. Language learning exposes your ego. Marriage does the same. Parenting too. They all ask the same question in different accents. Can you stay, even when you don't feel finished? Over the next sections, I will share what those 2 weeks revealed to me, through small moments, ordinary mistakes, and one surprisingly gentle shift in perspective. Not a miracle. Not a breakthrough. Just a quieter kind of peace that didn't require everything to change first. Because sometimes, peace doesn't come when life improves. It comes when you stop arguing with the parts that already exist. 2 weeks, no dramatic scenes. Nothing big happened during those 2 weeks. And that, strangely, was the hardest part. No shouting. No tears. No moment you could point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Life just kept moving at a steady, almost polite pace. And yet, inside the house, something felt slightly off, like background noise you only notice when the room goes quiet. You probably know this feeling. When everything looks fine enough that you feel guilty for being uncomfortable. When you tell yourself, other people have real problems. So you stay silent. You keep going. You pretend the discomfort will dissolve on its own. In the US, the days felt structured and efficient. School schedules. Grocery routines. Traffic patterns. Even conversations had a rhythm. But emotional life doesn't follow systems. It leaks through the cracks. And during those 2 weeks, I started noticing the smallest moments carrying the most weight. A pause before answering a question. A sigh that stayed a second too long. A look exchanged and then quickly withdrawn. These weren't fights. They were micro-frictions. And psychology tells us that micro-frictions are often more exhausting than conflict. Conflict has release. Silence doesn't. My brain kept trying to organize the feeling. It wanted a cause. Is it stress? Jet lag? Cultural adjustment? But every explanation felt incomplete. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. We were all tired of trying to be okay. Marriage, especially long-term marriage, doesn't break loudly. It erodes quietly when both people are busy being functional. You do what needs to be done. You show up. You care. But you stop checking in with the parts that feel unfinished. At one point, I noticed how often I was mentally rehearsing better versions of conversations that had already passed. That's a classic sign of rumination, the brain's attempt to regain control after perceived imperfection. Studies show that rumination increases when people feel emotionally responsible for maintaining harmony. In other words, when you believe it's your job to keep everything smooth, your mind never rests. This pattern showed up everywhere, even in my English practice. I would replay a sentence I had spoken incorrectly hours earlier. Not to learn from it, just to punish myself for not being fluent enough yet. That's not learning. That's self-surveillance. What struck me most during those 2 weeks was how invisible effort can become inside a family. Everyone is trying. Everyone is holding something. And yet, no one feels fully seen. Not because of neglect, but because each person is too busy managing their own inner noise. One evening, as we sat together without really talking, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't actually listening anymore. Not to my partner. Not to my children. Not even to myself. I was waiting for things to improve, for moods to shift, for motivation to return. That waiting is dangerous. Neuroscientists describe it as deferred presence. When your body is here, but your attention is parked in a future version of life where things are easier. The cost is that you miss the only place change can actually happen, now. There was no dramatic scene to wake me up. just a growing awareness that I was living on pause, hoping peace would arrive once everything aligned. But alignment never comes first. Engagement does. Those 2 weeks taught me that discomfort doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it asks for honesty. To admit, quietly, this is harder than I expected. Not as a complaint. As a fact. And once you admit the fact, something subtle shifts. The pressure to perform fades a little. The need to fix everything loosens its grip. You start noticing what's actually there instead of what's missing. That was the moment I stopped asking, "What's wrong?" and started asking, "What am I resisting?" Love looks different here. There is something about being in a different country that quietly rearranges your expectations. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones that slip past your defenses. In the United States, love didn't look colder or warmer to me. It looked more exposed. Less decorated. More practical. And that forced me to look at my own marriage without the usual filters. Back home, love often hides behind effort. You do things. You sacrifice. You endure. Here, I noticed how much emphasis is placed on emotional clarity. People name things quickly. They ask direct questions. They protect personal space. At first, I admired that. Then it made me uncomfortable. Because clarity removes the illusion that effort alone is enough. During those 2 weeks, I realized how often I equated love with endurance. If I can carry this quietly, I must be loving well. If I don't complain, I must be strong. But psychology paints a different picture. Research on emotional labor shows that unspoken effort, when unacknowledged, turns into resentment. Not because the other person is cruel, but because the effort never gets metabolized emotionally. In the US, routines were clear. Boundaries were visible. And that made the invisible parts of my relationship stand out more sharply. The assumptions. The unspoken rules. The silent negotiations happening in my head but never reaching my partner. One small moment stays with me. My partner asked a simple question. Not an accusation. Not a demand. Just a neutral sentence. And I felt defensive before I even understood why. That reaction had nothing to do with the question. It came from exhaustion, from years of trying to be easy to live with. Neuroscience explains this reflex. When your brain associates closeness with self-correction, it activates threat responses even in safe interactions. You are not reacting to the present moment. You are reacting to a long memory of self-editing. This is where the theme of imperfection began to sharpen. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of being seen as unfinished. As someone still learning. Still adjusting. Still uncertain. The irony is that English learning put me in the same position every day. Speaking slowly. Making mistakes. Pausing mid-sentence. In language learning, imperfection is expected. In marriage, we pretend it's a phase we should have outgrown. But love, I realized, looks different when you stop hiding the drafts. Here, love wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with reassurance or romance. It showed up in small, functional moments. A shared task. A calm correction. A pause instead of a reaction. And those moments asked a quiet question. Can you let this be enough for now? There is a concept in psychology called good enough functioning, originally used in parenting research. It suggests that thriving doesn't require optimal behavior, just consistent, responsive presence. When I applied that idea to marriage, something softened. Maybe love doesn't need polish. Maybe it needs room. One evening, while practicing English aloud, I noticed how gentle I was with myself when I mispronounced a word. I repeated it, slowly, without judgment. And then I laughed. Because I had never extended that same patience to my relationship. Different places don't change who you are. They remove distractions. They highlight patterns. And what this place showed me was simple. Love becomes lighter when you stop carrying it like a test. The question shifted again. Not how do we fix this? But what if nothing is broken, just unfinished? That thought didn't solve anything, but it created space. And sometimes, space is where peace begins. My children noticed first. Children have an unsettling talent for noticing what adults are trying very hard to manage quietly. They don't analyze. They don't diagnose. They simply observe, and then mirror it back to you in the most inconvenient way possible. During those 2 weeks, my children didn't comment on stress or tension. They didn't say, "Something feels wrong." Instead, they became slightly louder, slightly more impatient, slightly more emotional over small things. At first, I thought it was routine adjustment. New place, new rhythm, normal behavior. But psychology tells us something important. Children often express what the emotional environment contains, not what adults say it contains. They react to tone, pacing, and presence, not explanations. One afternoon, my child interrupted me while I was practicing English aloud. I felt irritation rise instantly. Not because of the interruption, but because I was already frustrated with myself for not speaking smoothly. That frustration leaked out before I could stop it. My voice changed. My face tightened. And my child went quiet. That silence landed harder than any argument. Later, I noticed how my children had started watching us more closely. My partner and me. Not anxiously. Just attentively. As if they were trying to understand the rules of this emotional landscape. Children do this instinctively. Developmental psychology calls it emotional referencing. They look to caregivers to learn how to interpret uncertainty. And what were they learning from me? They were learning that mistakes create tension. That pauses feel uncomfortable. That unfinished sentences deserve correction. Not through words, but through my reactions. This realization was painful. Not dramatic painful. Quietly sobering. Because it revealed something I couldn't ignore anymore. My discomfort with imperfection wasn't private. It was teaching. Research shows that children exposed to high self-criticism in adults often internalize similar patterns, even when criticism is never directed at them. They absorb the emotional rule, being wrong is unsafe. That was not the lesson I wanted to pass on. One evening, my child struggled to explain something in English, mixing languages, pausing, restarting. Normally, I would have helped quickly, corrected, smoothed it out. This time, I didn't. I waited. I stayed quiet. I watched their face relax as they realized no one was rushing them. That moment changed the room. What happened next was subtle but powerful. My child finished the sentence. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. and the pride in their voice was unmistakable. In neuroscience, this is called psychological safety. The sense that mistakes won't lead to rejection or tension. It's one of the strongest predictors of learning, creativity, and emotional resilience. And it doesn't come from encouragement. It comes from non-interference. I realized then how often love gets confused with correction. We think we are helping when we are actually managing our own anxiety. Especially in families. Especially in learning environments. My children didn't need us to be calm all the time. They needed us to be real without being reactive. They needed to see that unfinished doesn't mean unsafe. And that's when the theme of this story shifted again. This wasn't just about marriage, or English, or fatigue. It was about modeling a different relationship with imperfection. Because children don't do what you say. They practice what you tolerate. That night, the question returned, more clearly than before. What imperfection can you love today, so your children don't learn to fear it tomorrow? Why we chase perfect so hard. Perfection doesn't usually announce itself as a problem. It disguises itself as responsibility, as care, as high standards. That's why it's so difficult to question, especially in marriage, parenting, and learning something as personal as a new language. Your brain is not obsessed with perfection because it wants beauty. It wants predictability. Neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly scanning for errors, not to punish you, but to reduce uncertainty. Every mistake feels like a loose thread that could unravel the system. In family life, that system is emotional safety. In language learning, it's competence. In both cases, imperfection triggers the same internal alarm. I might lose control. During those 2 weeks, I noticed how often that alarm went off over nothing. A tone that sounded sharper than intended. A child misunderstanding a request. A sentence in English that came out wrong. Each moment felt like a tiny failure that needed immediate correction. This is called error sensitivity. Studies show that people under prolonged emotional responsibility, parents, caregivers, long-term partners, develop heightened sensitivity to mistakes. Not because they are anxious by nature, but because they have learned that small errors can have emotional consequences. The problem is that this sensitivity doesn't know when to turn off. So you correct too quickly. You explain too much. You apologize for things that don't need apology. You mentally rehearse better versions of moments that are already gone. And slowly, life starts to feel like an exam you're always retaking. What makes this exhausting is that perfection has no finish line. Even when things go well, your brain doesn't relax. It prepares for the next potential flaw. That's why achieving better rarely brings peace. Peace requires a different mechanism altogether. Psychologists describe this shift as moving from performance mode to presence mode. Performance mode asks, how am I doing? Presence mode asks, what's happening right now? The first creates tension. The second creates connection. I realized that I was stuck in performance mode everywhere. As a partner. As a parent. As an English learner. I wasn't experiencing moments. I was evaluating them. And here's the irony. The brain learns faster in presence mode. Language acquisition research consistently shows that learners retain more when they feel relaxed and safe, not when they are hyper-focused on accuracy. The same principle applies to relationships. People connect more deeply when they don't feel monitored. One night, after a long day, I deliberately let a small imperfection remain. A misunderstanding that could have been clarified. A slightly awkward silence. I didn't fix it. I didn't smooth it over. I just let it be. Nothing collapsed. In fact, something softened. The room felt calmer. Not happier, calmer. And calm is often the missing ingredient we mistake for happiness. That's when I understood why we chase perfection so hard. Not because we love it, but because we fear what will happen if we stop. But what if stopping doesn't lead to chaos? What if it leads to relief? Perfection promises safety and delivers fatigue. Imperfection offers uncertainty, and sometimes, peace sneaks in through that door. English, silence, and distance. Silence is rarely empty. Most of the time, it's full of things we don't know how to say yet. During those 2 weeks, I noticed how silence showed up in 2 places at the same time, in my marriage and in my English practice. When you are learning to speak slowly in a new language, silence appears between words. Pauses stretch. Your mouth waits for permission from your brain. And in those pauses, doubt rushes in. Is this the right word? Will this sound stupid? Should I stop? That same pattern exists in relationships. You pause before speaking. You edit internally. You choose silence instead of risking the wrong tone. And gradually, silence stops being rest. It becomes distance. I realized I was treating conversations at home the way I treated English. Carefully. Cautiously. Aiming to avoid mistakes rather than to express something real. Psychology calls this avoidant regulation. When people fear the emotional cost of errors, they reduce expression. It feels safe in the short term. In the long term, it creates disconnection. What surprised me was how familiar that distance felt. It was the same feeling I had when I avoided speaking English out loud in public spaces. Not because I didn't know enough, but because I didn't want to reveal where I was still unfinished. There's a well-documented concept in language learning called the affective filter. When anxiety or self-consciousness is high, the brain literally blocks input. You hear less. You retain less. Silence, in that case, isn't neutral, it's restrictive. The same thing happens emotionally. When the affective filter is high in a relationship, you listen less. You assume more. You fill gaps with interpretations instead of questions. One evening, after a long quiet stretch, I noticed how heavy the room felt. Not tense. Just distant. That's when it hit me. Silence was no longer a pause for connection. It had become a shield. So I tried something small and deliberately imperfect. I spoke before the sentence was fully formed. In English. Slowly. Awkwardly. Not to explain anything important, just to share a thought. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't smooth. But it broke the pattern. Neuroscience shows that novelty, especially self-initiated novelty, can reset emotional circuits. By doing something slightly different, the brain updates its prediction. This is safe. That moment didn't solve our distance. But it thinned it. Enough to let light through. I realized then that silence is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Silence can be generous when it's chosen. It becomes heavy when it's used to hide. Both in English and in love, progress doesn't come from waiting until you sound right. It comes from speaking while you're still unsure. Distance isn't created by saying the wrong thing. It's created by saying nothing for too long. One simple English sentence. The sentence was nothing special. No poetry. No wisdom. Just a short, imperfect line of English that would never be quoted anywhere. And yet, it changed the direction of those 2 weeks. I'm not okay today. That was it. 5 words. Spoken slowly. Without explanation. Without a solution attached. In language learning terms, it was beginner-level English. In emotional terms, it was advanced honesty. What made it powerful wasn't the sentence itself. It was the fact that I didn't decorate it. I didn't soften it with humor. I didn't follow it with a justification. I let it stand exactly as it was. Psychologically, this matters. Research on emotional disclosure shows that naming an internal state, without analysis, reduces amygdala activation. In simple terms, when you say what you feel, your nervous system calms down. Not because the problem disappears, but because your brain no longer has to carry it alone. In marriage, we often replace naming with managing. We explain. We rationalize. We downplay. We turn feelings into projects. That keeps things polite, but it doesn't create closeness. The same mistake happens in English learning. Instead of saying, I don't understand, we stay quiet. Instead of saying, I need time, we pretend we're fine. Silence feels safer than simplicity. When I said that sentence, something unexpected happened. The room didn't tense up. No one rushed to fix me. There was no advice. Just presence. That moment reminded me of a key principle in communication science. Clarity builds trust faster than competence. People feel closer to someone who is clear about where they are than to someone who appears flawless but unreachable. After that, I started noticing how many sentences we avoid because they feel too small to matter. Too simple. Too exposed. And yet, those are often the sentences that reopen connection. I'm tired. I don't know. I need a minute. In English, these are beginner phrases. In relationships, they are bridges. Language learning research supports this. Learners who practice high-frequency, emotionally relevant phrases build confidence faster than those who chase complex structures. Your brain prioritizes what feels useful to survival and connection. Once that sentence existed between us, other things softened naturally. Conversations became shorter but more honest. Silence felt less defensive. English practice felt less like a performance and more like play. I realized that peace doesn't arrive through perfect expression. It arrives through accurate expression. Saying what is true, even in broken language, creates alignment inside you. And alignment is contagious. That single sentence didn't fix the week. But it changed the direction. It shifted the goal from sounding good to being real. Sometimes, the sentence you're avoiding is the one that's already enough. Letting the mess stay. There is a strange relief that comes when you decide not to fix something immediately. At first, it feels irresponsible. Like leaving dishes in the sink overnight or closing your laptop with an unfinished sentence. Your brain protests. This needs to be handled. But if you wait, just a little, you discover something unexpected. The world does not fall apart. After that simple English sentence was spoken, I noticed a new urge rising in me. Not to repair. Not to clarify. just to let things stay slightly messy. In marriage, this felt almost rebellious. We are taught that love means effort, and effort means action. Talk it through. Solve it. Improve it. But psychology draws an important distinction between problem-solving and emotional processing. When emotions are still active, problem-solving often increases stress rather than reducing it. Your nervous system needs space before it can integrate change. I saw this clearly in my English practice. When I stopped correcting myself mid-sentence, my fluency improved. When I allowed pauses, my confidence grew. Linguists call this tolerance of ambiguity, the ability to continue communicating without full certainty. It's one of the strongest predictors of long-term language success. The same principle applies to relationships. One evening, a misunderstanding surfaced. Normally, I would have stepped in quickly, explained my intention, smoothed the edges. This time, I didn't. I let the silence sit. Not as punishment. Not as withdrawal. Just as space. What happened next surprised me. The emotional charge faded on its own. Without debate. Without resolution. Our brains, when not overstimulated, naturally return to baseline. Neuroscience calls this self-regulation. It's the body's quiet intelligence at work. By not fixing, I wasn't neglecting the relationship. I was trusting it. This was difficult. Because my identity is tied to being responsive, helpful, clear. Letting the mess stay felt like failure at first. But over time, it felt like respect, for myself and for others. Children, I noticed, responded immediately. When I stopped jumping in, they solved small conflicts more calmly. When I didn't correct their English instantly, they spoke more freely. Psychological safety grew in the absence of constant intervention. That's the paradox. Control feels like care. But restraint often creates more growth. I began to understand that imperfection doesn't need tolerance. It needs permission. Permission to exist without commentary. Without urgency. Without meaning attached. Peace didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a reduction of pressure. Not everything needs to be processed today. Not every sentence needs correction. Not every emotion needs a solution. Sometimes, love deepens not because you did something right, but because you chose not to interfere. What science says about acceptance? Acceptance often gets misunderstood. People hear the word and think it means giving up, lowering standards, or pretending pain isn't there. But in psychology and neuroscience, acceptance means something very specific, allowing internal experience without adding resistance. Resistance is expensive. It activates the stress response, tightens attention, and narrows perception. Acceptance, by contrast, frees up cognitive resources. You literally think better when you stop fighting what already exists. During those 2 weeks, I didn't feel happier. I felt less tense. And that difference matters more than we admit. Research in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, shows that when people stop trying to eliminate discomfort, their emotional flexibility increases. Emotional flexibility is the ability to stay present, adapt behavior, and maintain connection even when things feel imperfect. In families, this flexibility predicts long-term satisfaction more reliably than communication skills alone. I saw this play out in small ways. When I accepted my tiredness instead of pushing through it, my tone softened. When I accepted that a conversation didn't need closure, I listened more. When I accepted my broken English on certain days, I practiced longer instead of quitting early. Neuroscience explains why. Acceptance reduces activity in the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for rumination and self-judgment. When that network quiets down, you regain access to attention, empathy, and learning. In plain language, when you stop arguing with yourself, you become easier to live with. This applies directly to language learning. Studies show that learners who adopt a non-judgmental stance toward errors retain vocabulary faster and speak more fluently over time. Errors become data, not threats. Marriage works the same way. When mistakes stop being evidence of failure, they become information. You adjust. You respond. You move forward. One night, I noticed how peaceful the house felt. Not because everything was resolved, but because no one was bracing for correction. The emotional volume was lower. And in that quiet, connection returned naturally. Acceptance didn't remove responsibility. It clarified it. Instead of managing everything, I could choose what actually mattered. That's the hidden gift of imperfection. It reveals what deserves attention and what doesn't. When you stop trying to perfect the moment finally has room to breathe. Imperfect practice still works. There is a comforting lie many of us believe: I'll start when I'm ready. Ready sounds responsible, mature, sensible. But if you watch your own behavior closely, ready usually means when I stop feeling exposed. And that condition is almost never met. During those 2 weeks, I noticed how often I delayed things. Not because I lacked time or skill, but because I didn't want to face the feeling of being unfinished. English made that feeling obvious. Marriage made it unavoidable. On low-energy days, my English sounded flat. Words came out slower. My listening lagged behind. In the past, those were the days I skipped practice. I told myself I was preserving motivation. In reality, I was protecting my self-image. Cognitive psychology calls this self-handicapping, avoiding action so failure can't confirm our fears. It feels smart. It feels safe. But it quietly freezes growth. Language research shows the opposite path works better. Consistent exposure with low emotional stakes creates stronger neural connections than occasional, high-pressure effort. Your brain learns patterns through frequency, not brilliance. Slow input. Repeated contact. Minimal judgment. Marriage operates under the same biological rules. You don't strengthen a relationship through perfectly timed conversations. You strengthen it through reliability, through showing up when you're tired, through staying engaged even when you don't feel articulate or generous. One evening, I practiced English while the house was alive with noise. A child asked a question. Someone laughed. Someone interrupted. It was messy. Normally, I would have stopped, waited for a better moment. This time, I didn't. I kept going. My sentences weren't smooth. My pronunciation drifted. But something important happened. My body stayed relaxed. And when the body relaxes, learning accelerates. Neuroscience explains why. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter linked to learning and motivation, responds not to correctness, but to positive engagement. When the task feels safe, dopamine flows. When it feels evaluative, cortisol takes over and learning slows. The same chemistry shapes relationships. When interactions feel safe, people lean in. When they feel monitored, people pull back. I realized I had been waiting to feel confident before practicing. But confidence doesn't precede action. It follows repetition. So I changed the metric. Instead of asking, "Did I do this well?" I asked, "Did I return today?" That question removed pressure. Returning became enough. Some days were strong. Some were dull. All of them counted. Imperfect practice works because it lowers the cost of participation. You don't need motivation every day. You need permission. Permission to sound average. To feel slow. To remain unfinished without self-attack. The most stable progress I've made, in English, in patience, in love, came from staying present without demanding proof of improvement. You don't grow by being flawless. You grow by staying long enough for change to become normal. The imperfection I chose to love. For most of my adult life, I believed love was measured by improvement. If something could be smoother, clearer, or faster, then caring meant helping it move in that direction. This belief looked harmless, responsible, even. But over those 2 weeks, I began to see how quietly destructive it was, especially inside a marriage, a family, and a learning process that refuses to move on command. The imperfection I chose to love wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like conflict or failure. It looked like slowness. Slow replies. Slow mornings. Slow emotional shifts. Slow English sentences that needed space to exist before they could make sense. At first, slowness irritated me more than obvious mistakes ever did. Mistakes can be corrected. Slowness feels like resistance. Like a lack of care. My brain labeled it as inefficiency, and inefficiency triggered anxiety. But neuroscience tells a different story. Human nervous systems process information at different speeds. Some people respond quickly because their brains prioritize rapid integration. Others respond slowly because their brains prioritize depth and coherence. Neither is superior. But when you pressure a slow processor, their performance drops sharply. I saw this pattern everywhere. In conversations that stalled because someone needed time. In my own English practice, where words arrived late but carried more meaning. In family moments where rushing only increased tension. One evening, I noticed how peaceful the house felt when no one was being hurried. Conversations were fewer, but more sincere. Silences were longer, but not heavy. It felt like the emotional volume had been turned down, not off, just softer. That's when I made a deliberate choice. I would stop treating slowness as something to overcome. I would treat it as information. Psychology calls this reappraisal, changing the meaning you assign to a stimulus. When you reappraise slowness as care, not avoidance, your stress response decreases. Your body relaxes. Your listening improves. The effect was immediate. My tone softened. I interrupted less. My English sentences became simpler but more accurate. When I stopped pushing for speed, clarity arrived naturally. This is attunement, the ability to match your pace to the emotional rhythm of others. Research shows attunement predicts relationship satisfaction more strongly than communication techniques or conflict resolution strategies. People don't need perfect responses. They need to feel met where they are. Choosing to love this imperfection didn't mean giving up standards. It meant adjusting timing, letting processes unfold without interference. It also changed how I treated myself. I stopped rushing my thoughts. I allowed pauses. I trusted that meaning would arrive if I stayed present long enough. Slowness taught me something simple and profound. Peace rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly when you stop pulling life toward your preferred speed. I didn't fix anything by loving this imperfection, but I stopped exhausting myself trying to outrun it. Peace is not the absence. For a long time, I misunderstood peace. I thought peace was what arrived after problems were solved, after conversations were completed, after emotions were regulated, after English sounded fluent. Peace, in my mind, was a reward at the end of effort. The last 2 weeks taught me something very different. Peace is not the absence of tension. It is the absence of resistance. Nothing in my life suddenly became perfect. Marriage still required attention. Children were still unpredictable. My English was still slow on some days and awkward on others. The difference was not external. It was internal. I stopped bracing. Neuroscience explains why this matters. When you are constantly preparing for correction, yours or others, your nervous system stays in a low-level fight-or-flight state. You might function well, but you never truly rest. Peace cannot exist in a body that is always preparing to adjust. What changed was subtle. I stopped scanning moments for what needed improvement. I allowed conversations to end unfinished. I let English sentences exist without polishing them mentally. I let emotions pass without narrating them. And something remarkable happened. Connection increased. Research in relational psychology shows that people feel closest not when interactions are perfect, but when they feel unmanaged. When no one is trying to steer the moment toward a better version. Presence becomes enough. That was the peace I found. Not calm all the time. Not happiness every day. But a steady sense that nothing essential was wrong. One night, sitting quietly, I realized the question that began this journey no longer felt urgent. What imperfection can you love today? Had done its work. The answer wasn't a specific flaw anymore. It was a posture. I could love the fact that today didn't resolve everything. I could love the fact that learning, language, people, myself, remains unfinished. I could love the fact that peace didn't require proof. This channel exists to help you practice English slowly. But beneath that, it invites something deeper, the courage to stay with yourself while you're still learning. While your life is still in draft form. Because peace doesn't arrive when you finally get it right. It arrives when you stop treating "not yet" as a failure. If you are tired of pushing, correcting, fixing, this is your permission to pause. To practice slowly. To speak imperfectly. To love what is present, not what is promised. That is where peace lives. Before you close this video, stay with me for one more quiet question. Not the kind of question that demands an answer. The kind that lingers with you later, while you wash dishes, while you drive, while you practice one slow English sentence tomorrow. What imperfection are you still trying to fix? That might only need to be loved. Most people keep scrolling, keep learning, keep improving, without ever stopping to ask that. And that's why progress feels heavy. Because when everything becomes a project, nothing feels safe anymore. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not coincidence. It means you're paying attention. And attention is where real change starts. So here's a small invitation. Not a challenge. Not a promise. Tonight, don't correct one thing. Don't fix one sentence. Don't improve one moment. Just notice what stays when you stop pushing. If this video gave you even a few minutes of calm, save it. If it described something you couldn't quite put into words, share it with someone who's learning slowly too, English, love, or life. And if you want more stories like this, real, imperfect, and honest, subscribe to the channel and walk this slow journey with me. Because peace isn't found by becoming someone else. It's found when you finally stop leaving yourself behind.